But the lack of alarm, but it's just funny to me sometimes the way one story can get blown in a different direction than another. And, of course, more still may come out about this. But where are you at? What's the latest you've heard on Wes Welker yet?
Well, and I constantly talk about this, and one of the problems is no matter how many leaks you hear, they're coming from somebody with an ulterior motive. So whether, Wes Welker claims, someone spiked his drink, or he was using, Molly voluntarily, we don't really know that because of the confidentiality of the policy. And I constantly talk about that. When you heard certain things about Josh Gordon, for instance, and, claiming that it was secondhand smoke in one instance, claiming one of the test failures was for codeine and not marijuana. Again, and I'm not trying to take aim at certain reporters, but, if you have a few sources and you feel confident with it, by all means go and report it. But it doesn't necessarily make it true, because I constantly talk about the PED stain in the National Football League. And for whatever reason, the general public regards taking performance-enhancing drugs as far worse and traditional, what people consider as traditional performance-enhancing drugs, whether it be a form of a steroid, human growth hormone, something like that, as opposed to taking, whether it's speed, whether it's marijuana, what have you. So, there's reasons why people kind of run away. So when you hear, is that what Wes Welker tested positive for? I don't know. I have no idea. Is he telling the truth? Could somebody have spiked his drink? Does he have a history of this type of thing? No, he does not. In theory, it's possible. But, if you put a gun to my head, I'm going to tell you it's not true. I mean, players will lie, and they generally lie to keep their name away from the things that are considered worse by the general public, and that's just the way it is. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it wrong, and that's why you have these policies, and that's why it doesn't matter if someone spiked, Wes Welker's drink at the Kentucky Derby. It could be 100% true. I feel sorry for him if that is true, but it just doesn't matter, and he can look to his peers as the reason why it doesn't matter, and not only the NFL's eyes, but in the general public's eyes.
And I'll tell you what, John, I thought of you and I laughed so hard this morning when I read this line in the story about an inside source saying that the positive test was for Adderall. And I'm like, that's your go-to, like what you just said. You're like, well, that's the easy one. Well, I failed, and they come up with the explanation that's the lesser evil that I didn't have a prescription for it, and that was my fault, or I didn't have a prescription for my cough syrup, that was my fault, and it can't be questioned. But when I saw that the Adderall, I just laughed. I said, that's almost the example that John uses every time we talk about this was, well, we could just say it was for Adderall or something that they go, oh, well, that's different. That's not, as bad as this or as bad as that. And then also, too, the delay. Like you said, people have agendas in the media. How long ago did ESPN, we were talking about Josh Gordon, it seemed like for 6 months waiting and waiting and waiting. This was a few months back, and it's just now blowing up and coming out there right on the verge of the season starting, even though, and it's funny because the Broncos clearly had leeway and head time to notice or to be told what was going on because they were making preparations behind the scenes apparently for this. So just funny when you look at the different situations, how they get to the media, when they get there, and how long they sit there, and how what I mean, all of that, different ways it all goes out. Depends on the agenda a lot, like you said.
Yeah, and that's, I talked about that. I've written about it a lot, and that's one of the biggest problems I have with the various policies is the fact that there is no rhyme nor reason to the appeals process, and there is no real concrete timetables for any of it, and it can affect the competitive aspect of the game, because and I always go back to I always use the StarCaps case as an example of that, because they suspended a couple of Vikings players, a couple of Saints players when they were significant. Both teams at the time were significant Super Bowl contenders.
Yep.
And they did it late in the season. And, why? We never get those explanations. And that's generally a big hole in the policy, and it makes people ask questions, because when you suspend impactful players, high-profile players in big situations, you say to yourself, and then news comes out, well, they knew about it 6 months ago, or they knew about it 8 months ago. Then the timing comes into question. And the worst thing, even worse than performance-enhancing drugs or any scandal you could think of, would be, are you affecting the outcome of the game by delaying decisions or slowing down decisions? People don't ask those questions as much as they should, because these suspensions have impacts on teams. No one knows that better than Cleveland.
Yeah.
And the fact that they're without their best offensive player for the full season. But imagine, if Cleveland was in the midst of a playoff race, and say, Josh Gordon was suspended last year for 2 games, but instead of the first 2 games, say that came in the week 14. Why? Those questions are never answered.
No, I totally hear where you're coming from there. And you talk about agendas, and I'm half joking when I say this, but I told people when the Josh Gordon news came out, the timing of it being not that long after the regime change, I said, that's Lombardi and Banner. They got all the media connections, and they wanted to trade Josh Gordon and weren't able to do it. And that's them going, see, we told you back in Cleveland. And I was joking, but that's quite possible. Hey, Lombardi is known for having the connections, especially with Pro Football Talk, and he was always a good source, man. And I wouldn't be surprised at all, though, if that's why it got out so early instead of closer towards training camp, like a lot of these have, like Welker here.
I wouldn't be surprised at all. And I do want to correct myself and say those questions are asked; they're not answered, is how I should have phrased that, because they have been asked in the past, and I've asked them myself. And they're not answered, and the league leans on the confidentiality clause consistently, as well. And they have to in a legal sense. But there's got to be a way where you can sort of negotiate something with the NFL Players Association and say, well, we don't need to talk about what people tested positive for, but as far as the decision-making process, that should be made public. The appeals process and the timetable, all that should not only be public, it should be above board, and people should have clear and defined dates as to when these things are going to happen. So if you're for instance, if you're scheduled to be suspended, like Josh Gordon, that should be published. That should be a part of the public record. If you've appealed it, that should be part of the public record. A date should be set up, and a date when you're going to make the decision should be set up. And I don't think that's a difficult hurdle at all, but for whatever reason, the league and the Players Association don't agree.
No, and you've heard my idea as far as what the players and the agents say it should be. You have the right to remain silent. Should you choose not to, then what you say can be used against you, because then the league can say, no, they're not telling the truth. If you keep your mouth shut, then we can't say nothing. But the minute you go, I took Adderall, they can go, no, that's not what he failed for. Try it again, But anyways, hey, moving on, like you said, let's get off the field stuff and let's get to the on the field stuff. Before we look around the NFL, Browns made their final cuts. Obviously, still a few roster tweaks here. And I right before you called in, I was talking about last year I saw a lot of it, and this year, and I know that's what teams do. They turn over the bottom of the roster a lot during the season. But, like, you know, cuts were made Saturday and Sunday over the weekend, and you got your group together. But then you make those couple, and you just keep turning guys over. And I'm thinking, man, really? From Saturday to Sunday, Sunday to Monday? Sometimes it just seems like a lot of those, oh, I got this guy. Oh, never mind, this guy's here. I'm going to try this guy. And nobody stays long enough to even have a practice. They're just on the roster for, 12 hours, and then they go, never mind, we're going to sign this guy. Is that around the league common, or, only certain teams kind of do that more than others?
Only certain teams do it more than others, and Jacksonville specifically last year did it a ton. The Patriots constantly do it, so it's not necessarily an indication of lack of talent. They like to turn over the bottom of the roster. In New England's case, I think they like to keep everybody on their toes, especially guys towards the back end who need to work hard, and their mentality is you could be gone next week. In Jacksonville's case, it's completely different. The fact that they didn't have a ton of talent, so they spent last year trying to bring in as many football players as they could to try to find one or two contributors. So there's two ways you can look at it. In the Browns' case, I think they are attempting to find, going more the Jacksonville route. I think Ray Farmer doesn't necessarily think the talent level is where it should be, and he's, trying to find a gem or two by churning players in and out.
I just, I get it during the season. We saw him do it a lot throughout the season last year. I was kind of, that period of just a couple of days here from the weekend where I'm telling you get an email, in the evening that says Browns, grab this guy and that guy. Then the next day, well, they changed their mind on this guy. Now they grab that guy. And I'm like, well, I could see if a guy came in and practiced and you go, well, I don't really like what I'm seeing here, but they change their mind sometimes before the guys even get in and practice, but I'm with you. Hey, that's how they unearthed, like an Edwin Baker last season, and he turned out to run the ball a little bit for him. And they, you find guys like that. I think they found Obaniah that way a few years back. Speaking of Obaniah, he was one of the Browns' cuts. What were your thoughts when you looked at Ray Farmer and Mike Pettine's final roster, how it shook down? 12 defensive backs, pretty heavy in that category. Most teams carry a few less than that. What were your thoughts on some of the decisions they made? Anything really head-scratching to you?
No, I think that's more of an indication of the way the NFL is going. As far obviously it's a heavily base passing league now, so you can never have enough defensive backs. And you take a look at Atlanta, for instance. I mean, if you look at their depth chart, they don't even bother with the third linebacker anymore. They just use a 4-2-5 on their depth chart. Because that's the way the league is going, and the fact that, and we always talk about the lack of tackling, and one of the reasons why is because I think we always talk about it with the running back, and people are aware that how much that position has been devalued throughout the NFL, at least until late in the season, when you get to the playoffs and some bad weather games, and then all of a sudden Marshawn Lynch means something. But the other side of the coin is linebackers have been devalued, and specifically run-stopping linebackers, because, they're not going to play all that much. At best, they're going to be in there, they'll be a two-down player, and more often than not, you're a nickel or dime for far more than 50% of your plays. So I think carrying a lot of defensive backs is the way the trend is going around the NFL. It's not just the Browns. But, for the Browns specifically, if you look at what they did, it's pretty clear the defense is way ahead of the offense, and that's gonna be what has to carry this team this season.
Absolutely. I mean, you could see that there. And at wide receiver, I mentioned today that Coach Pettine had mentioned that by Wednesday, you'd kind of have a final, at least a shakedown of where the roster's going to sit and settle for at least the first game here. So here we are. It's Wednesday. You're in game prep now. So because I had thought maybe with